So males are obliged to compete with each other in terms of genetic quality. So the whole basis of a dominance or indeed a prestige hierarchy is you've got a rank ordering according to genetic quality. From that, obviously, the female role, which fits in with that, is to then select preferentially the higher mate value, the higher genetic quality males. And that way, the males who don't reproduce or reproduce less or produce less reproductive output in terms of quality time quantity, they take the dodgy genes with them out of the gene pool. That's the whole basis of all our social systems across species, ours not excluded.
Very happy to have Steve Moxon as a guest today. Steve, hello.
Hello there.
Could you introduce yourself a bit, please? How did you come to be doing what you currently do in life, which is working as an independent researcher on the differences between the sexes?
Good question. It's a weird route. I did in my youth do a BSc psychology degree at Liverpool University, but I got so fed up with all the Freudianism and behaviorism at the time that it put me off academia for 20 years. I got into it very back, well, as I say, I'm independent, that is not affiliated to university. I've done it through the back door, really because I was a whistleblower through working for the civil service and immigration, and I got a book out on that. I got on the back burner a book which became The Woman Racket, which is a polemic which turned into a science, popular science thing, sort of fell between two stools really. And because I got the book out on immigration, the same publisher, with a bit of prod from Bruce Charlton, who read it and raved about it, evolutionary psychologist at the University of Newcastle. I got that out, and he actually edited a journal, Medical Artists. So I got my first journal article published, and it just went from there.
Right. The Woman Racket is the book that Steve mentioned there, and I would highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon and various places. It's an excellent book. So let's start with the basics then. There's a lot of talk about men and the purpose of men, whether it's just about oppressing women and generally making trouble in the world. So from your perspective as a scientific researcher, what are males for in evolutionary terms?
Yeah, well, you have to go back to the foundational problem in all biological systems, which is the accumulation of gene replication error. In other words, mutations, sort of not quite working very well, genetic combinations, whatever. You've got to have some way of getting rid of them. It was always assumed that the sexes and sex itself evolved for the purpose of creating variation on which selection could act, and that's how you get evolution. We now know that's wrong, and I've written a paper on this myself. The purpose of both sex and the sexes, well, sex is in its various stages is to bring about DNA repair, but in general, sex and sexes evolved to maintain genome integrity, genomic integrity, i.e. how the genome fits together so we don't go extinct, basically. The way to do that through the sexes is, and well, there's there were originally different reasons, quite simple reasons why you got male and female, why you got different mating types, which is a separate question. Once you got those, the evolutionary process recruited, if you like, the sexes to function to deal with this gene replication error accumulation in what's been dubbed the genetic filter or the mutational cleanser, as Westover calls it, mechanism. So males are obliged to compete with each other in terms of genetic quality. So the whole basis of a dominance or indeed a prestige hierarchy is you've got a rank ordering according to genetic quality. And from that, obviously, the female role, which fits in with that, is to then select preferentially the higher mate value, the higher genetic quality males. And that way, the males who don't reproduce or reproduce less or produce less reproductive output in terms of quality time quantity, they take the dodgy genes with them out of the gene pool. So that's the whole basis of all our social systems across species, ours not excluded.
So that means that life is actually quite tough for males, isn't it? The purpose is
absolutely
to compete, to display genetic fitness. And
I am, I certainly am living proof of this.
And the point is prove yourself to the females so then they can select who is worthy to reproduce with. Why not, though, have lots of variation on the female side. Why vary the male side more?
Because when you start off with the sexes, obviously you quite quickly get small mobile gametes, which is the male, and large sessile, relatively non-motile females, and because they're larger, they have all the nutrients that the subsequent zygote uses. So it makes sense you have a polarization in sexual function, right? So as soon as you get onto this need for this genetic filter or mutational cleanser mechanism, it makes sense to effectively quarantine all that sort of activity on the male side of the lineage, and you leave the female side of the lineage just to get on with reproduction. So their criteria thereby is much narrower. It's not about genetic quality, it's about fertility, which in human terms is youth and beauty, basically. So there's much less of them to, in terms of their own qualities, to fall out about, because what females do fall out about is trying to be the partner, the pair bond partner of the alpha or a very high-ranking male. And obviously, there's big, tough competition amongst females for that.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, isn't it? Because what you're saying here is that most people have seen those nature documentaries where all the male birds, for example, gather in one spot and they tough it out to see who's going to be the last one left. And all the women are watching. Yeah, all the women, the female birds are watching from the sidelines, picking and choosing. The whole of life, human life, is a bit like that for males. What car you drive, what job you have, etc. Yeah. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, everything we do is ramification of that at some remove. So obviously things can spin off and become ends in themselves. But as I've argued in an early paper in 2010, I think, about culture being part of biology as well. If you think about it, everything that spins off from this doesn't actually really spin off. That is, it doesn't spin off at a tangent. The only reason that things like our facility to have culture, the only reason that evolved in the first place is that it functions to feedback, to fine tune and reinforce the very biology that gave rise to it. So far from undermining our biology, in actual fact, we become more and more efficient in our biology as we become more complicated, including our social systems and culture. So the idea that you can come up with politics like feminism somehow, which can deny biology and construct human society as if from a blank slate anew, is particular nonsense.
Yeah, there's that wonderful phrase from E.O. Wilson that biology keeps culture on a leash. And yes, you can go quite far. The leash can be long, and sometimes you might forget it's there, but ultimately it is there.
Well, I did take issue with that because I think it's sort of right, but it's not right really, because it doesn't point up. As I say, my point is that it actually feeds back to reinforce and fine tune. So it's not just being, it's instrumental to. It's not just that you've got some leeway up to a point. The whole point of the leeway is because it does function to actually strengthen what gave rise to it. I think it's a really profound. I say it myself. I think it's really quite a profound insight, and I've had discussions face to face with Stephen Pinkett and others about this. They don't seem to get it, or they don't put it in those terms, and I don't know why, but yeah. So I take issue with that leash thing. I mean, it's right up to the point,
yeah,
and it's certainly something that makes anybody who accepts social constructivism to think again. But I think it could have been put better.
Yeah. Now, coming back to this idea of male competition, then, to be male is to exist in various forms of hierarchies in a way that females don't. Why do men compete with each other so fiercely to form hierarchies? It starts even as toddlers, doesn't it? 2-year-old, 3-year-old boys know this.
Yeah, it does. And of course, the problem that's not being researched, I'm about to do a review paper on this. My first ever review paper was about dominance hierarchy that needs updating. And there's more research done now on not just dominance hierarchy, but what we call prestige hierarchy, and how these different facets, there seem to be of the same thing. But it is all pervasive. And as I say, I've already answered this question really about the genetic filter.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not the only it's not the only aspect of male sociality. I mean, if you look at social psychology experimentation into the sense of in-grouping, our sense of what group we belong to, we know that males have no same-sex preference at all for in-group partner, whereas women have a 4 to 5-fold same-sex preference. Now, if you think about males, we're not just in our male exclusive dominance hierarchy. We also function in our natal, or what do you like to, our whole group, which includes women and children, which we're obliged to defend, as any Ukrainian will certainly better tell you at the moment. And so males do have this identification with the natal or subsequently symbolic group, like, you know, your university year group or your employer or whatever. So which is over and above, and I'm quite interested in the relation of the psychology of that and sociality of that to straight male dominance hierarchy. And there are some questions still to be answered in that, and it's subject of a forthcoming paper I'm doing.
So what you mean by that idea about in-group preference is that men are more likely to identify with whole communities or even symbolic communities or nations. Is that
Yes.
correct?
That's right. I mean, if you're going to look at, say, you know, primitive, in inverted commas, so societies such as, you know, African remnants of hunter-gatherer societies, and you'll see that obviously they have initiation ceremonies, and some males fail that. You can effectively end up as an adult child, if you like. So you're not excluded from the community, but you're not part of the male hierarchy. You're not really an adult member of the community. So even those are still included. It's quite hard to be completely excluded if you're male from this grouping.
Mm. Now, can females get excluded in the same way? Do they exist in a hierarchy?
No, this is stuff I've recently been working on, and there's not much in the academic literature about cliques. There's lots of stuff in parenting literature, and it sort of creeps into scholarly literature in psychology today, particularly. That's the only place. But yeah, Robin Dunbar of Oxford University, a brilliant chap. He used to be the professor where I was university. I was there before he went there. He was a psychologist. He's done a lot of work on primates, and he shows that a pre-adaptation for pair bonding evolution in all primates is the idea that females, they're quite fractious, and you need to interpolate males between them. And typically, females can exist together in groups of about 5, and that's it, which is the same as the average size of a human female clique, right? Now, I thought previously, and I've written about this, that, well, why is it that humans have these female cliques? I thought, well, with female exogamy, that's marrying out, don't they need to prepare themselves to form close bonds for mutual child care with stranger females in their new environment of the group, where their pair bond partner, a husband is. But then I realized, well, no, and in actual fact, we are female exogamous, but it's really half and half. We have endogamy as well. Half of females or so actually stay in their natal group. And well, what is their objective within the natal group? Well, they're trying to pair off with if possible, the alpha male or another high-ranking male. And given you've got this pre-adaptation of these structures where you've got small numbers of females with interpolating single males, well, that's the basis of how we can then get a harem, you know, in a polygamous society. Now, of course, humans supposedly are not polygamous. We actually are. Richard Dawkins described it. Human society as clandestine polygamy. If you think about it, an alpha male in society, he's got all sorts of parallel pair bond partners, not just his official one. And so we have this situation. Females in our society are fiercely competitive, and so these cliques are really proto-harems. So the populace, the top female clique, they're the females who got together. They realize they are pretty high in fertility, in youth and beauty. If they group together with 3 or 4 other females similarly, they are best placed to actually become the harem of the alpha male. So that's what it's all about. And that's why it's such fierce competition to get into the top clique. And of course, it's very easy to get dumped out of the top clique if for some reason you're judged not to be up to the mark in terms of your fertility, then you're out and somebody else will be brought in. So this is why I would argue, and Joyce Benenson is a leading expert in the world on this. She's written a paper on this saying that, I forget the exact title, it's something that, you know, the essence of female sociality is exclusion. It's an exclusionary principle. So whereas males essentially are inclusive, females essentially really are exclusive, quite contrary to the rhetoric we hear about male-female society today.
Funny about the exclusionary element in female psychology then, because you could argue that cancel culture itself is a form of feminine aggression in that it's mainly verbal. Someone said the wrong thing and now they can't come and play dolls at the tea party. It's that kind of model, isn't it?
Well, yeah, of course, obviously, this is to do with politics, and it's a bit more difficult to analyze where that comes from. And obviously, men engage in cancel culture. But yeah, I think a lot of people have observed that cancel culture seems to be something which is even more fiendish when it's perpetrated by women than by men. I'm not sure if that's true, but yeah, I think it does seem to relate to female sociality more than it does to male sociality. I think you've probably got a point there.
Now, men, when they're establishing the rank of the hierarchy, will often resort to physical altercations. How do women, who presumably are less keen to engage in physical fights because it might mar the very things they're using to attract men, and they're more fragile physically, they want to avoid fighting because it's a risk, it mars their reproductive potential. How do women engage in that kind of aggression then within the cliques? You said people can get exiled from the cliques very quickly. Is that bullying? How does it work?
It's quite subtle because, of course, there's no hierarchy as such. There's what I would describe it as a first among equals. So you've got the queen bee, and apparently there's been research on this. This applies to all cliques at all levels, not just the top popular clique. As reading things like Wiseman and things, everybody's got a slightly mistaken impression. But you've got a first among equals, the queen bee with other 4 people or however many there are in the clique. And you've got one person who's a wannabe, who's like the deputy queen bee or the queen bee in waiting for the queen bee herself to be deposed. So, the cultural milieu, social milieu of that is that everybody ostensibly is all nicey, and highly cooperative, and it has to be. So another aspect of this is these are remnants of cooperative breeding systems, actually, which we might come on to. But at the same time, underneath the subtext is that a killer blow, in inverted commas, could be struck at any one time. As you say, because of the need for both parties to avoid serious physical damage. Though, of course, we know that females famously fight no holds barred in ways that males don't, and particularly with their male partners, of course, because they don't expect any serious retaliation. But there is also this notion of indirect aggression. But there's quite a bit of research being done on this, partly by feminists, so it's difficult to know what to make of it. But it used to be thought that this was the quintessential mode of female aggression, indirect. But it's now known that's not really so, in that I think because males are so fiercely competitive, they will utilize whatever mode they can. So it may not be vis-a-vis males a peculiarly female, but I think with females compared to other modes, it is the primary ones. I think that's a difference. That's what's probably been lost in all this new discussion. Oh, men and the trend always is say, oh, actually men and women are actually much more similar than you think, and of course they're not.
Now, what effect does that kind of relational aggression among females have on fertility? I've read a bit about how it can actually suppress fertility. Is that true?
Yes, well, any sort of agonistic behavior or any psychological, I mean, females are remarkably susceptible to stress. I did a review paper on this. There's a whole new research paradigm in stress response mechanism. There's no overlap in stress response mechanism between males and females, even in humans at all. They're completely sex specific, completely separate systems. It makes sense for females to be more responsive to stress because they need to avoid it. Males almost manufacture stress because they need to compete to acquire status. It's the opposite for females. So there is this problem. And of course, there's plenty of studies in humans as well as in primates and mammals showing that there is serious consequences of reproductive suppression. Both physiologically, you become physiologically relatively infertile, if not absolutely so, and also psychologically, it damps down all the psychology and behavior to do with it. And this fits in what I alluded to, mentioned earlier, that human cliques and these small groupings with male interpolations in primate species, it does look like something akin to cooperative breeding mechanism. We all know from the Meerkat Manor TV series, the meerkats famously, there's the alpha, well, it's the first among equals, female who's the sole reproducer, and she reproductively suppresses, in this case with meerkats behaviorally, and the others become effectively just alloparents. In other words, they're incapable of reproducing themselves and just manifest their sexual reproductive motivations in helping to nurse, to care for the offspring of the alpha female. And I think that human cliques, female cliques, are similar. I think they may be not obligatory, but facultative. That is, in certain extreme ecological circumstances, it may be that certain females only get to reproduce. It may be the queen bee in each clique, or it may be just the queen bee in the top clique. So the queen bees then physiologically, behaviorally or psychologically suppress the reproduction of the other members of the clique, and they then only become alloparents. That way, the limited resources you've got in times of severe ecological stress are used to make sure at least you get some offspring through to the next generation and you don't go locally extinct. So clearly it's adaptive. And that's what I think, whether this is vestigial in us humans or whether it's actually still there in evolutionary play, so to speak, I don't know. Nobody's actually discussed this apart from myself.
That's really fascinating. So the environment people are in, if it becomes particularly stressful, might lead to the majority of females becoming infertile and just the ones at the very top, maybe even one at the very top who still maintains it. Wow.
Yeah, and of course, this may feed into the big sociological quandary we have now is the demographic transition, which is global. Every country in the world is seeing the start of, if not quite long way along the process of reduced fertility. And I put out a speculative paper on this a while back. There's a number of different mechanisms. And this might have something to do with it. And there may be some, because we're under such ecological pressure through our sheer population levels, that there may be some natural evolved feedback mechanism to damp down population. This is highly speculative. And obviously people are thinking in terms of economic, socioeconomic explanations, because they don't work, because you've got to have an explanation that works with both rich and poor, urban and rural, because in all those contexts, the same thing's happening. And I've speculated that it may be crowding stress on males, because in rodents, this has an impact of severely depressing both physiological fertility and reproductive related behaviors in F1 to F3 female offspring. It's a remarkable, absolutely stunning scientific finding. If that's even remotely applicable to humans, that is likely to be a major factor in explaining the demographic transition.
That sounds like a really fascinating area for further research.
It is.
Yeah, you mentioned a bit about pair bonding earlier. just want to keep bringing you back to a few of the big concepts being introduced so people can dwell on them a bit more. Where does pair bonding actually come from, and why is it the preferred female mating strategy? Because I guess if females are the limiting factor in reproduction and they are what men are competing for, they get to have things their way. They decide on what terms sex is given.
Absolutely. Pair bonding, we now know, did evolve in the female, not the male interest. As I mentioned earlier, there's a pre-adaptation in this, in terms of, because all primate species need to group together to avoid severe predation. We've got the problem that lots of females in close proximity are fractious, and we get these interpolated males. So you've got these groups of one male and a handful of females. So you've got a pre-adaptation there for harems. So therefore you get pair bonding in terms of polygamy. Polygamy, of course, is pair bonding. It's just a number of parallel pair bonds. And monogamy is just residual polygamy. Obviously, once you've certain females have nicked most of the good females, the other males probably aren't of sufficient high enough mate value to actually have be polygynous, but they're just monogynous. But yeah, so why do females choose pair? Well, in order essentially to project forward in time their peak fertility. If you're a female, say 18 to 20, that's at your peak fertility, right? What can you do to effectively project into the future that point? Obviously, if you reproduce promiscuously by a different father each time, then as your mate value falls off a cliff, which it does, then the quality of your offspring is going to progressively go down. If you can anchor down one high mate value male, which you're in a position to find and attract when you're at your peak 18 to 20, and then have subsequent children by that same male, then you are in effect projecting into the future your peak fertility. But having said that, this guy is just the backup. You can then have extra pair sex if you can find a significantly higher status male than your male partner, have sex with him, pass off the offspring as that of your pair bond partner. So females effectively have the cake and eat it. And of course, the other function of the male pair bond partner is to act as bodyguard. It's always been thought that mate guarding, as it's called, was in the male interest. It's not. It's in the female interest. So it fends the male mate guard, the pair bond partner, fends off the male lowlife, either males of lower status than he is, which the female partner's not interested in, but he's in no position to fend off or stop the female being proceptive towards significantly higher mate value males than he is, right? And we find this is a research outcome looking at various species. The same thing's been found. And research is asking, well, what's the point of mate guarding evolving if it doesn't work? Well, it does work. It works selectively in the female interest, not in the interest of the male mate guard. He's providing a service in return for sex with a better mate value, higher fertility female than he would get if he was just going in for purely promiscuous sex.
That's really interesting. So
fascinating, isn't it?
The research, just top of my head, isn't it about, most people say about 10% of children are actually from extra pair sex. It goes higher. Some people say more like 20 to 30, but let's say 10% of men are actually bringing up a child that's not their own, but they don't know it.
That's right. Of course, it's very, very difficult to get accurate data on this, and the data vary wildly. It used to be taught in medical schools, so it's 15% in UK medical schools. I think they're probably in a better position to know than virtually anybody else. It's very, very high in some hunter-gatherer societies. I seem to remember something like 40 to 50% even in some cultures. But again, how that data is obtained is probably a bit dodgy. But yeah, it is quite substantial.
So the way that works, just to clarify for people, is that, let's say I am a 20-year-old, really stunning female, peak fertility, and I bag a guy who is in the area the best I can get. But then at the time when I'm ovulating and He doesn't know it, but someone else comes along. Let's see Ronaldo or some Premiership footballer right at the top of the pecking order. And then he can subtly sense that I'm ovulating. And then without my pair bond partner knowing, I can then get pregnant. And then the pair bond partner is going to provide the resources to raise the child.
Yeah. And the point there, of course, is the pair bond partner is not really in a position to do much about it, whether in terms of the approach by Ronaldo or the proceptive behavior by the female partner towards Ronaldo, probably meets in the middle. Because obviously, this only works if it's a really significant differential in mate value between the pair bond partner and the cuckolding male. It's not worth it for the female if there's not a big gap, right? She doesn't want to lose her backstop, does she, at the end of the day? But in that situation, the Ronaldo is going to be either physically tougher or he's going to have a better set of male coalitionary mates that can duff up the pair bond partner if the pair bond partner decides to do something about it. Because he'll never get there, because over evolutionary time, you'll have evolved psychological, cognitive, and behavioral repertoires to actually head off that possibility. You'll just basically just buttonhole it and just suffer it. Basically, that's what's going to happen.
I see.
So so it's all stitched up in the female interest. It really is.
Yeah, well, and that comes back to what we said about if you're the limiting factor in reproduction, you get to call the shots.
You call the shots. Exactly. Yeah, that's it. And the female in all species is always the limit, because you start off, the larger, initially the larger gamete. You've got all the you are the gestating sex. Yeah. So it follows then that you are the sex that does all the child care as well, and you can only have one child or twins maybe, or triplets even, every so often. Whereas in a male, you can be Genghis Khan and father 8% of the human race or whatever.
Yeah. So the idea that monogamy is an instrument of male oppression pretty much couldn't be more wrong.
It's complete bollocks. Sorry, man, I say that.
Yeah, of course you can.
It's complete nonsense.
So what I want to know then is, you painted a picture of the world where there's really fierce competition between males. Females compete a little bit, but in a different way. It's not really a dominance hierarchy.
No, but it's just quite fierce, though.
Yeah, certainly. Now, why is it that males don't compete with females? For people who are wondering.
Because there's no biological sense can be made from it. As you alluded to earlier about the risk to the female of physical injury, or even of psychological impact to reduce their fertility. Is a problem. So why would you actually risk that when you don't need to? But why would a male? I mean, obviously, if you think of contemporary society where we have like an amorphous social system which is sort of partially blind to sex. You go and work for a corporation and you go for a job. You could be competing with another female co-manager to become an executive. But that's only a de facto competition. It's not, I would argue, it's not psychologically salient to either males or females. They're doing it because that's just what the work hierarchy demands. So I think it really is quite strict. There's no such thing as competition between male and female. And I know in science there's this idea of sexual conflict. But whenever you analyze it, it all breaks down into same-sex conflict. There's never, even in an extreme situation such as infanticide. I mean, people often say, "Oh, well, this is an example of how males are cruel to females." The lion comes along and kills the lioness's cubs, so that she then starts cycling again. He can impregnate her and become the father. But if you look at the actual wider picture, that is in the benefit of all parties, because the lioness is now as a much more higher mate value male partner. Therefore, very quickly has higher genetic quality offspring. And bear in mind, in species like a lion, cubs are more likely to die than survive anyway. So the investment she's made is not like in species like ours, where there's much more care for offspring, and they're much more likely to survive. So in the round, even in an extreme situation like that, what seems to be sexual conflict breaks down into it not being. So really the competition there is between the male lions. The competition is not between the lion and the lioness. It's because the losing party there is the male lion who fathered those cubs that the displacing lion actually kills.
Lions are a fascinating example. Let's just pause on them for a second, because not many male lions make it to adulthood. It's very difficult, isn't it? And the reason that the females really value the ones with the darkest, thickest manes, I've read, is because it's hot in Africa and lions are big animals, and the mane is actually a disadvantage.
Yeah.
So if you
it's a similar thing to the classic instance, of course, of the peacock's tail. You know, why would you evolve as a male, you know, a peacock, to have this fantastically long guff of brightly coloured flowers sticking out your bum? You know, it's obviously it reads "eat me." You know, well, the reason is because the females know if the male has survived all those predation effects, he must have a fantastic set of genes. Let's mate with him.
Yeah, honest signaling, it's called, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, in humans, what forms might that take? Because I know there's things like with when deer are mating, the females are attracted to the calls of the deer, which can't be faked because it's to do with like the depth of the chest cavity. Same with frogs as well, the ribbit. Now, in males, do we get that? How does honest signaling work? Is it what car you drive?
Well, between males, we know that there's honest signaling. We know that there's some frequencies below some sort of low frequency in the male voice, which just communicate relative status. So if you have in a psychology lab, if you put males in and you manage to filter out those sounds, male communication breaks down because the males don't know what each is a relative status. Now that's between males. You don't need to communicate that. I mean, females are obviously they're obviously evolved to be wise to false signaling from males. They expect lots and lots of false signaling from males. Therefore, they'll want an independent sort of assessment of this. So in terms of costly signaling, well, having a mansion with 50 bedrooms in it and all the whacking great mortgage and all the guys you've got to kill or best to actually maintain that, I think that's pretty costly signaling. Or indeed having a fantastic £200,000 car that is very likely to kill you in the next few months, traveling at the speed that you're supposed to go in to actually impress women with. That's another example of costliness. So most of the things that feminists sort of think that is expression is the fruits of power of men is actually the things that men have to do, which actually cost them in order to get females.
So as you might remember, in the extremely naughty lecture that I made, I quoted Tony Montana from Scarface when he says, first you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the women. And that was deemed encouraging toxic masculinity. But the poor bloke was only doing what he needed to do to get the women. They choose what signals what they value. That's right, yeah.
So the trick of the guy is to find ways that are actually somehow intrinsically satisfying. But of course, these things do become, as I mentioned earlier, this idea that things can spin off and become their own justification. Like me doing all these bloody science review papers, you know, this is obviously designed to, even at my age, stupidly, to try and impress some young woman. It's not going to do, obviously, but I keep doing it. But I find it intrinsically satisfying. I don't need to be aware that that's what I'm doing. I'm still going to do it anyway. So the trick for guys is try and ditch the things that really are foolhardy and likely to get yourself killed or seriously in trouble with lots of other guys just for the sake of getting women, and do something which is a little bit more benign. But we don't have to go the whole hog and buy the toxic masculinity crap, which of course is a complete, as you say, is a complete misreading of what's going on.
Just before we move on, could you address what I know frustrates quite a lot of young guys, talking about the selection criteria on dating apps? You see these diagrams sometimes where it says basically that Pretty much all women are looking for someone who's 6 foot or above. Is height to do with signaling? Why are women interested in height?
Well, height obviously is because obviously the more height you've got, the more you're going to be easily dominate other males. So height's obviously also means you're going to be a more successful hunter in evolution. So it obviously makes sense that, and we know that height is a key criterion. I mean, I'm 5'7", so 5'7", ugly, weedy. What chance did I ever have? You know.
Well, you write good scientific papers, Steve. So
yeah, but I'm too old now.
So that's interesting. Height then would be an advantage in combat with other males. You've got more leverage. You can punch down, literally, things like that.
And in hunting, so bringing home the bacon as well as duffing up the competition. So either way, it's good. It's obviously going to be an important criterion of male mate value.
Yeah,
and obviously, the taller you are, that means the more muscle built you're going to tend to have. I mean, obviously, controlling for body type.
Yeah,
the taller you are, the more muscular you're going to be as well.
Yeah, and height, funnily enough, is a pretty good proxy for earnings as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's because tall guys do impress. If you're in an interview, if you're a tall guy, you are, research shows, you are considerably more likely to get the job. You're also considerably more likely to get elected presidents if you're running in the US presidential election race. Tall guys is quite a big advantage.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that one. So how is it then that the setup you've described with the two sexes functioning in this way? I suppose ultimately it's for the benefit of children, isn't it? So that's the point of life, staying alive to reproduce. We don't stay alive just to stay alive.
That's right. The idea that the primary concern is survival is wrong. The primary concern is reproduction. You cannot have any sort of biological entity unless fundamentally it reproduces, right down to slime, bacteria, whatever. The most simple, I mean, the simplest thing we've got, which is on the cusp of life, which isn't life really, is a virus. What is a virus all about? It's about replicating. If you can't replicate, it has to use cells of another organism, much more sophisticated than itself, in order to reproduce. But that is the be all and end all. But that just shows you how fundamental replication is. You only survive long enough to reproduce. When we survive a lot longer than we reproduce, but we're not selected. I mean, this is why things go haywire with our bodies and minds as they get older, because there's never been any selection pressure to actually hone all that. As long as you get to reproduce, after that, selection is not much interested.
Now, you've used the term symbiosis to describe how the two sexes interact. What does that actually mean, and how is that different from the model that's common in the social sciences, whereby the relationship is just men oppressing women?
Well, for all the reasons we've gone to, the notion that men oppress, I mean, even from feminist principles, the notion is nonsense. Because if the sexes are exactly the same, as feminism insists, then how can one sex systematically oppress the other? I mean, it's logical nonsense. Symbiosis obviously is a biological term. It means relationship between two different species. So I'm using it as an analogy. So obviously, the sexes are not different species. We're in the same species, but it's the same thing. It means that they fit together like hand and glove. They dovetail together. One makes no sense whatsoever without the other, and vice versa. That's what I mean. So yes, it's a perhaps unfortunate term to use because it is an analogy.
It works well though, and it points to the fact
it conveys what I mean.
Yeah, and the ultimate end goal is the child. So women, for example, are valued by and protected by men because they're a proxy for children ultimately.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, on that note, let's talk a little bit about the proposal to make misogyny a hate crime. I know you've done some work on this. In your view, why would it be a mistake to make misogyny a hate crime?
Because misogyny, as currently defined, does not exist.
Steve, what's led you to that conclusion?
There was a review in 2016 by was it somebody, Barron and Bernanke? I can't remember the first name.
Dunham.
Dunham, Barron and Bernanke, 2016, seminal paper. And they quote on page 5, regards from men and boys, and whether it's implicit or explicit, they found, and across all age groups, they found, quotes, I think exact quote, no negativity towards female whatsoever. That's the exact quote from page 5. And that's a review of all the studies done so far. I did a paper published in 2018, which further reviewed subsequent studies to that and looked wider at concepts of sexism. And there is no basis to the notion. Now let's get this definition right. By misogyny, as previously understood and still in common parlance, is that it's a very tiny minority of males, and there are female equivalents the same, who through some life experience, a series of failed romances, whatever, have a generic disdain for the opposite sex, right? That's the common understanding. We all accept these people exist. Women, conversely, just men. The current understanding, which is purely ideological, is simply that there is a universal amongst male, implicit, inbuilt, although some people like Baroness Kennedy say it's learned, they're just confused. But there's basically a universal disdain, contempt, rather than out and out hatred necessarily, towards all women, and that this manifests in all interactions between male and female. That's what they're claiming. There's no evidence for that. Not only is there no evidence at all for this, that is, not one single published science paper has ever demonstrated that this exists. Not only that, but all the research in what's called the gender attitudes literature shows that, on the contrary, there is phylogeny, not misogyny, and misandry, and that misandry is the real biggie. There are, in some cases, I think, older boys that are sort of more or less neutral, but even there is no actual negativity towards females. So this is, I think, now the big linchpin in feminist ideology, and what I'm now getting involved in activism with Gender Parity UK and others to actually press government. We've had some success, we think. We have some influence because the government has rejected, on the advice of the Law Commission, actually, the Law Commission decided that there shouldn't be an extension of hate crime to a new domain based on sex, or as feminists wanted, just misogyny and not misandry. But none of those. The Lords amended to put it in, then it was rejected by about 130 votes in the Commons. What's happening now is that with this new online safety bill, which obviously is going to get passed in some form, no mention in there at all about sex, misogyny or anything, but in the secondary legislation that they're dreaming up, they are planning to really go big time with misogyny in the guidance. So they get around the legal things, but so in practice, even though on paper in the act there's no sex discrimination, there will be massive sex discrimination against men using this notion of misogyny in the guidance. So we're working on that, trying to head that off at the moment.
If we come back to that idea of females being precious because they're the limiting factor in reproduction, it helps to make sense of why misogyny, just on the face of it, doesn't make much sense. Because if we take the extreme of a really beautiful 20-year-old woman, that's one of the most powerful people you can imagine in the world, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, this idea that oh, men rape women because they're misogynistic. You know, well, you know, we know sex rape is not about power, contrary to what feminists say. Plenty of research showing it is obviously about sex. You only got to look at the profile of the type of victims to better tell that. So this idea that you've got to hate in order to be sexually attracted to someone is obvious, self-evident nonsense to everybody except a feminist. But people seem to buy this. As you said, there's no theoretical basis, no conceivable theoretical basis to the notion of misogyny. It just does not make sense on any level.
And if we take misandry, which you say there really is evidence for,
Yeah,
there are quite good reasons why both men and women wouldn't like low status males.
Exactly. I mean, the key purpose of a lot of rules in all societies is to prevent sexual access by most males, or by all males in some situations. Not just the males have been excluded, through initiation ceremonies. There are adult children in the community, but as you say, the majority of males are the low status males. We know through all of the recent evolution of hominids that only 40% of males ever reproduced, so presumably ever had sex. 60% of males were effectively had no life and were excluded. Well, you can't achieve that without some pretty hefty policing. Obviously, there's internalized psychology to do with that. Males repress themselves, but there's got to be a lot of overt social rules, which are externalizations of evolved psychology to us. So it's foundational. So obviously, if you put all that together, you can see that generally as misandry. It's general antipathy towards males, unless you unusually display something through your achievements or something intrinsic, whereby you are somehow unusually deserving.
The point you made there about what rape really is and being able to tell what it is from the profile of the victims isn't talked about much, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 16 to 17-year-old girls are actually the most likely to be raped because they're menstruating, they're physically signaling fertility, and they're also unlikely to have a male bodyguard with them because they're so young, they're not yet pair bonded.
That's right. I mean, the mistakes made and Debra Soh actually remarks quite bravely. Debra Soh, the sexologist, wrote a brilliant book. It's the best book about trans that's been written. I'm drawing it quite a bit. My forthcoming paper about sex is binary, including orientation and identity. But what she makes the point is that the quality common to rapists is psychopathology. They are basically they have no regard for anyone. So it's not they are not indicative of general toxic masculinity. They have this unusual quality. Same as we know in domestic violence, we know in partner violence, males normally self-inhibit and don't aggress, and the ones that don't have got some sort of psychopathology. And I think the same is true of rapists. So this is what people have got wrong. Normal males, well, let's qualify this. Obviously, there are situations where there's communication breakdown, and that can lead to charges of rape. We're talking about what most people formally, or most people still understand as rape, which is coercion when it's quite clearly coercion, right? I don't think normal males do that. They may do it in a war theatre where there is general profound circumstances which can counteract normal self-inhibition. But normally within a community, and I think you have to be crossing some sort of profound in-group, out-group boundary as well, in targeting a female for rape. So that's it. It's psychopathology by definition, unusual males.
Yeah, your point about war is an interesting one there, because people are uncomfortable with the fact that psychological studies show that rape is actually one of the most common female fantasies. And if you look at women's romance fiction, the plot often depends on something like that. Now, if we go to a war scenario, if all the men in your community have just had their heads smashed in by a bunch of invading males from elsewhere, then you've now been told basically that these guys who have come in and taken over are of superior genetic quality. And it might be adaptive to then be submissive in breeding with them.
That's right. This is, I mean, this is a very controversial area, but the theory about why the basis of warfare is actually to acquire en masse foreign females.
Yeah,
there's actually a serious theory of the basis of war.
Yeah,
and we know from all warfare we're seeing now in Ukraine, this is pretty well a universal theory, a universal feature of warfare throughout history, as in contemporary times.
Yeah, look at the rape of Berlin.
Yeah,
one of the most famous examples. And if women are the limiting factor in reproduction, then one of the reasons for a male tribe wanting to go elsewhere and take over another is to get more women.
Well, the other thing, of course, is that the males who within their own community are going to be fairly restricted in sexual access. In a war theatre, when they're in a foreign community, they will have license to engage in sex they would not have within their own community. And of course, we've evolved to be, at least in part, female exogamous. So the idea of you're bringing females back from a foreign community into your own is part of the norm as well. So this is where the normal idea of rape breaks down, in that it's hard to argue that it's only psychopathological males who are carrying out rape in war theatres. It would seem to me that relatively normal males are doing this. So that's again, this is far too sensitive for anyone to have written research papers on, but it's like in so many areas. It'll be a paper I eventually get to tackling, no doubt. But yeah, it needs some work on.
I don't think there's many people who would do it except for you, but that's the benefit of being independent and not affiliated, isn't it?
Well, we'll see how my forthcoming paper on sex is binary, including orientation and identity fares. It may get quite a few brickbats.
You brought up domestic violence there. That is often one of the big things that people use as supposed evidence for misogyny. But you've written a bit about how intimate partner violence is, in fact, mostly perpetrated by females.
Yeah, I've written 3 review papers on this, started in 2011 and one 2020. Yeah, the evidence now is quite clear that well, the paradigm for 40 years of research in science now has been that that it's non-gendered, to use the term they use. But what they qualify that, they're saying females are at least as violent as men. Now that covers a multitude of sins, because all the recent research particularly shows is that women are far more violent than males, and the younger the couples you look at, the more this is true. If you use proper dyadic study, you look at holistically, and look at the violence both ways. If you look in adolescent and young adult couples, you'll find that violence in terms of initiation and who prolongs it, etc., on all dimensions, the perpetrators are largely the females, and all the different independent lines of evidence which contribute to a conclusion about overall conclusion about the nature of partner violence, they all converge on the same conclusion, that it is preponderantly, if not overwhelmingly, female perpetrated. And we know from experimental vignette studies that partner violence is actually the preferred mode of aggressive behavior by females, specifically in a couple context. But in any context where a female will be a target, normal males, are self-inhibited. The research is quite startling, and again, people aren't picking this up.
Isn't it true that there are actually neural pathways that stop men from unleashing their full power physically on women if there's any kind of altercation?
That's right. I mean, I have to look back in my own notes and paper to actually discuss that further, because it's 2 years ago out of my head. But yes, there's on several levels actually, in terms of hormonal and as you say, neural pathways. These have now been found. So as I say, there's so many completely independent lines of evidence, all converging on the same. It is now fairly incontrovertible that partner violence is predominantly a female perpetration and male victimhood problem.
Now, what is it for then? Why is it mainly female perpetrated? What's the point of it?
Well, obviously males are self-inhibited for reasons we've already discussed.
Yeah.
There isn't the need for the female to self-inhibit because females know, unless they've got a psychopathological male partner, he's not going to hit back, or he's not going to hit back in earnest. Therefore, she can resort to violence with impunity. Now, looking at the deeper etiology of it, again, it relates back to the importance of the female of pair bonding, because females value pair bonding much more than men do. Therefore, they'll do various things, quite extreme things, in order to maintain them, including extreme controlling behavior. We know that the controlling partner in most sexual relationships is the female rather than the male, again, with the exception of psychopathological males. And we all know from research, it's well known that one aspect of controlling behavior is physical violence. So that's the basis of it. But there is also another, and this is what I've discovered, including my last paper, that there's another issue to do with explaining premenstrual tension, PMS, because we know that there's a problem females have. That for large parts of their cycle, if they had sex, this would threaten potential implantation. Obviously, a female doesn't know if recent bouts of sex have led to impregnation or not, but obviously, the adaptive to in case that is the situation, that they take steps to avoid any problems of impregnation. And if having subsequent sex with males, as we now know, actually does significantly impede the possibility of impregnation, then it's adaptive for the female to have a behavior repertoire to stop sexual access, even by a pair bond partner, for large parts of the cycle. And that seems to be the explanation for PMS. And obviously, that's another basis, I would argue, of female perpetrated partner violence.
I see. And the role of oxytocin in this is interesting too, isn't it? It's that oxytocin lowers the female's fear of the male, because having sex as a female puts you in a very vulnerable position. You're alone with somebody who's much more powerful than you are physically, and that's quite scary. But the oxytocin removes the fear. But by removing the fear of that particular male you pair bonded with, it also means you are more likely to fight. Is that correct?
Well, obviously, yeah. I mean, the data on oxytocin is a bit confused and complicated. I'd have to look back to my notes to actually comment on it further, because and there are some very, very stark sex differences here as well. Oxytocin on males, that's in males, it's to do with hostility or not to outgroup males. So it functions completely differently. Oxytocin, as we'd expect, it mainly functions for females in a sexual relationship context. But yeah, there are a number of different, to some extent, conflicting findings, and they are conditional on circumstance, which without my notes, I wouldn't better comment on further, off the top of my head.
Sure. Now, to finish off, let's just start with the topic that a lot of people will have heard a particular narrative on going through the schooling system. Tell me a bit more about the issue of the vote historically for women.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I wrote about this, the woman racket, which I say is fallen between two stools, between polemic and science. I got more into the science as I went on. But the central two chapters are history, and one of them is about the history of the franchise. And what's really interesting, and there's a guy called Martin Pugh, who's written several books on this, is a leading figure in the world, certainly in the UK, on this topic. And he really is attacks the feminist position on all aspects of this. What we now know is, what we know from history anyway, is that females always had the vote at local level in both the parish and the manor courts, and at local levels where all their interests lie, right? Only males had an interest directly in anything going on at national level, which of course until recently was simply to do with wars and the taxes to pay for them, right? So the demographic deficit, the democratic deficit has always been male, not female. Only in 1918 did we actually finally arrive at a point where a majority, where more than 50% of males actually effectively had the vote, despite being obviously at that time being sent off for 4 years to be blown up and shot in the trenches. It was only very latterly, in the very end of the 19th century, early 20th century, that the situation changed, and to some extent, women's interests were also impacted by decisions at national level, and it made sense then to extend the franchise to women. Now, in Parliament, there was already in the late 19th century a majority of people in favour of doing this. The question was timing. Obviously, the big quandary was, well, how will this upset politics? How will women vote? And of course, the problem with the suffragettes is they confirmed the worst fears in people's minds about how women might behave if they got the vote. So the suffragette activity was instrumental in delaying women getting the vote. In the end, what happened was, in 1918, when the government were faced with having to by massively increasing income tax to pay for the war, they had to spread the tax base. They had to bring a lot more men into income tax, and they couldn't do that without extending the vote. Obviously, on the no representation without no taxation without representation. Yeah, and it was that point I thought, right, well, on the coattails of that, we could then bring in the female vote. Okay, with the slight condition that some age band. The suffragettes, of course, had long campaigned not for that. What they voted for, because they were all largely upper middle class or upper class women already with 2 votes in their household. Their male partner had a financial qualification and a university or commerce industry vote. So they wanted 3 votes for their household, but they wanted an educational qualification to disqualify most women and most men from having the vote. All this has been lost in contemporary discourse about the history of this. It's quite remarkable. But the history could not be more different from what is currently made out about the history of the franchise and the women's vote in particular.
Yeah, so for most of history, including up to about the first Reform Act, 1832, about 2%, 3% of men had the vote.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was several. It went up in stages, bits at a time. But of course, the property, your wealth, income criteria still figured right up towards the end, and which meant that most men didn't have the vote. And as I said, most men still hadn't got the vote, even in 1918, or at least not practically so, because of the laws to do with you're moving one place to another, and obviously being in the trenches meant effectively you couldn't. So yes, technically a bit before then, more than 50%. But by the way, the main truth is that when did the welfare state come in? Well, pensions, 1906, is it really? See, all the welfare was administered locally. So if you got the vote at local level, as women had in both the parish and manor courts, then you had the right to turn up. You're expected to turn up and vote. Then you got as much control as men had. In fact, you had more, because you were more likely to be available, because you were less likely to have a onerous, long hours, full-time job.
Steve, this is really fascinating information that is not really available in many other places, or indeed in some topics any other places.
Well, I've distilled it. I've pulled it from various sources. So it's my job is arranging it in a bit more reader-friendly form, maybe.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of books throughout the course of the interview. The Woman Racket, which I'd highly recommend people read. Debra Soh's book as well. The End of Gender, is it called?
That's right, yeah.
Is there anything else you'd recommend that you found particularly interesting on these topics?
Books, not really, to be quite honest. Well, obviously there's Warren Fowle's The Myth of Male Power, which was making similar arguments to what I make, but from the perspective of the social sciences. I've had a conversation with Warren about this. He accepts this. Is that it's a shame that it doesn't come from it's not a biologist, and it doesn't know biology. But it's interesting stuff. So that book in particular, obviously I could plug on one of my own as well. Subsequently, in 2016, I published a book called Sex Difference Explains, which you don't have to buy. It's free on the New Male Studies website, or you can buy a cheap hard copy off Amazon, of course. But that's more the science, getting over the problem of the woman racket being falling between polemic and science. And I'm sure to start on what all my honey badger friends keep badgering me to do, which is a genuinely popular book that ordinary people can read. You know, people do complain that my text is a bit too academic and sciencey, and that I really do need. So I'm going to. So this will be not Son of Woman Racket. It will be more science and polemic. But yeah, sorry. Other people's books, apart from Myth of Male Power, not really. I think there are more seminal science papers.
Yeah,
I think than there are books, and a lot of the popular stuff on evolutionary psychology. Matt Ridley's actually one or two books. If you want to read evolutionary psychology books about the sexes, Matt Ridley might be the guy to start with. I think is the most cogent writer in the popular science field on that. Steven Pinker's not very good and far too long-winded. I don't really rate his stuff.
He also withdrew support for me after initially saying he was with me. He got contacted, I think, by someone, and he said, "Oh, you know what? It was a defense of masculine virtues, and we can't be having that."
He's not a deep thinker. I once collared him face to face from the audience at the LSE. There's a symposium, and it was on this subject of, his famous quote: "I have told my genes to go jump in the lake." So I stood up and said, "Well, sorry, I beg to differ, Professor, that your genes have told you to go jump in the lake. You know, you're this high-flying, even psychology professor, you've been driven to get a position in order to attract women, you know, and you're saying, well, you know, you've got your wife, you don't, you know, you're a perfectly respectable person. But the point is, you are in the position to take advantage of lots of experts, etc., if you so wanted to, right? And that's your genes have driven you to do that. You are in no way have you subverted your genes. Anyway, he sat down, stared into the central aisle for about 2 minutes, and then the chairman moved the thing on. He got no reply. He's just not a thinker. Like Richard Dawkins, great biologist, hopeless philosopher. You know, like rubbish he talks about religion. You know, he doesn't know the first thing about what the function or the evolutionary basis of the notions of supernatural are. So yeah, so a lot of these supposed great thinkers, they're communicators, and you know they can distill down to simple term popular science, but they don't have the depth and range of thinking. That's my objection, which is why I've not recommended to you any books, because I really don't think there are any. Yeah,
to be honest, if there were any books, it would be quite hard to get them published.
Well, this is part of the reason the books are so crap is they've all been watered down in order to be published.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I couldn't get the Woman Racket published until Keith Sutherland of Imprint Academic, who was daring enough to publish my book on immigration, which no one else, well, Penguin were going to do it. They couldn't get out fast enough. But yeah, it's I think things are changing though. I think there are publishers realizing that there is a gap in the market and there's an increasing large audience who are against PC, identity politics, cancel culture, the various names, and that this is going to be a fast growing market, and with the main publishers shying away completely from it, that this is what's going to break it all open. I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. Well, I'll put links to those books you suggested in the video description. And if you've got any papers in particular you think are relevant to this, if you send me the links to those as well, I'll add them.
I'll think on that. Yeah. But,
right.
Yeah. I'm sure actually I will better think of a book eventually. But yeah, I did mention Matt, The Origins of Virtue, Matt Ridley. It's a great evolutionary psychology book on the quandary of why we are moral, as it were. It's quite easily. I forgot. The Mating Mind, Geoffrey Miller. Wonderful chap. That's a really good book. Yeah.
We'll add that to the list then.
Yes. I mean, it's in some ways superficial, but he really gets down to the nub of it. So the idea that everything we do ultimately is to do with trying to get a mate, and no one is it's the universal acid of evolution. It really conveys. And of course, they're coming thick and fast now. The great philosopher of evolution, of course, is Daniel Dennett. His main philosophy book he talks about the universal acid of natural selection and evolution, and it's a really brilliant book. Freedom Evolves is quite a good one, but he doesn't get to the root of it. It doesn't, which goes back to what I said earlier about the leash idea not being that accurate, and because it actually does feedback to fine-tuning. He doesn't get to that. I find that the big trio of the big bods in evolution, him, Dennett, Pinkett, and Dawkins, they all suffer from the problem that they're not actually deep thinkers at the end of the day. They're not real philosophers. We're lacking in evolution a particularly deep thinker, I feel. Well, I'm not claiming to fill the boots myself, by the way.
Well, you've definitely given us some deep thoughts today, and there's a lot for people to think about. And that reading list, I think, with the papers added on, should give people plenty to reflect on. Really grateful for your time. Thank you.
Well, nice to talk to you, because you are the biggest brain I know, I'll tell you.
Oh, no. I've just read a few of your books, Steve. That's all.
Now, you are a serious intellectual, and I've never met anybody with a better brain than you. There you go.
Thanks so much for the interview, and I hope to do it again on some other topics.
Yeah, that was thoroughly enjoyable, and thanks for your time.